So for thousands of years, whenever human beings have faced a real crisis,
Yeah, like a collapsing economy or something.
exactly, a famine, a political disaster, or even just, a deeply personal failure, we've looked at our leaders, our institutions, or even just looked up at the sky, and we've demanded the exact same thing.
A magic trick.
Right, a miracle. We want a cheat code, basically, to bypass the grinding reality of our situation.
We really do.
We expect that someone, somewhere, can just pull a lever and instantly reverse years of systemic decay.
Just wave a wand.
Exactly. But what if the universe's absolute refusal to give us that magic trick isn't a sign of indifference? What if it is, like, the ultimate declaration of human maturity?
That forces us to confront a really uncomfortable psychological truth, I think.
How so?
Well, the desire for a miracle, what we could call miracle hunger, it's a symptom of a profoundly infantile mindset.
Wow, infantile, that's a strong word.
It is, but think about it. When you observe a toddler facing a problem, they don't, analyze the variables.
Right, they just scream.
Exactly. They cry out, and a giant, seemingly omnipotent parent swoops in, alters the physical environment, and the discomfort stops.
And the kid learns absolutely nothing about how to solve the problem.
Right. They only learn that crying brings a savior. So when adults demand sudden, inexplicable reversals of fortune, they're basically asking to remain in that toddler state.
They want the rescue without the responsibility of agency.
Exactly. They want the comfort without the work.
And that sets the stage perfectly for what we're exploring today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are taking a scalpel to a very specific classical text, Surah Ar-Ra'd, which is chapter 13 of the Quran, specifically verses 7 through 11.
But we're taking a different approach today, right?
Yeah, completely. We are setting aside all the traditional theological and, ritualistic commentaries. Our mission here is to extract the brilliantly sophisticated framework of social physics and human psychology that's actually embedded in these verses.
It's essentially a manual.
Exactly. A manual on how the psyche operates and how internal mental shifts aggregate into massive macroscopic societal changes.
And that refusal of the miraculous that you mentioned from verse 7, that's really the foundational premise of this whole manual.
Right. The text describes ancient populations constantly demanding their messengers perform supernatural feats.
To prove their authority. Like, turn this mountain into gold right now.
Or bring the dead back instantly.
Right. And the text consistently responds with a very hard boundary. It effectively says, look, you are standing in a universe governed by flawless, observable physics, and you are asking for parlor tricks.
Which is such a powerful reframe.
It is. Because giving in to that miracle hunger, it destroys the very foundation of human development.
It inevitably builds a personality cult. Right. I mean, the text points this out with brutal historical accuracy.
Absolutely.
Whenever someone in history supposedly broke the laws of nature, the public response was never a deeper understanding of universal laws or, an elevation of societal ethics.
No, they just started worshiping the messenger.
Right. They stopped looking at the message completely. They built tombs, held festivals, and created these massive corrupt hierarchies based entirely on the perceived magical abilities of one individual.
They traded the intellect, the character, and the systemic vision of the leader just for the comfort of a wizard.
For a wizard, yeah.
And from a psychological standpoint, that makes perfect sense. Because the human psyche inherently seeks the path of least resistance.
They're lazy.
Basically, yeah. Absolving yourself of liability is the ultimate comfort.
Oh, absolutely.
If a society is rotting from corruption and a savior can just, wave a hand to cure it, then I, as an individual citizen, I don't have to examine my own micro-corruptions.
Right. I don't have to look at my own taxes or how I treat my neighbors.
Exactly. I don't have to rewire my internal biases or change how I conduct my business. But this text is actively stripping away that psychological safety net.
It's demanding maturation.
Yes. It's stating that the unchanging law of cause and effect is the only mechanism of reality you are ever going to get.
And I really want you, the listener, to let that sink in for a second. Think about your own life. Where in your career or your relationships are you secretly waiting for a magic fix?
We all do it.
We do. Where are you banking on a sudden windfall, an external savior, or, a miraculous turn of events, rather than doing the unglamorous, grinding, systemic work of understanding cause and effect?
because this ancient text is essentially holding up a mirror.
Yeah, and telling you that the universe does not respect your impatience.
Not at all.
It only respects the physics of action and reaction.
So if we accept that the universe operates strictly on process rather than magic, we really have to understand the specific nature of that process.
And the text doesn't use an architectural or like a mechanical analogy to explain this, does it?
No, it uses biology.
Yeah, verses 8 and 9 drop us right into what we could call the biological clock of consequences.
The gestation analogy.
Right. It uses the profound process of pregnancy. It details knowing exactly what the womb holds, the precise fluctuations of what increases and decreases, and the absolute unalterable timing of the gestation period.
It's a brilliant framework.
It presents this as the ultimate framework for how our societal and personal actions bear fruit.
Gestation is the perfect psychological metaphor here because it happens entirely in the dark.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, think about it. Complex cells are dividing, intricate neural networks are forming, an entire skeletal structure is being built.
But you can't see any of it.
Exactly. To the outside observer, for a very long time, absolutely nothing appears to be happening.
Right.
The entire architecture of the new reality is being constructed in the unseen realm. And we struggle with this immensely because our brains are chemically wired to crave immediate feedback loops.
Like touching a hot stove.
Yes, you touch a hot stove, your hand burns instantly, and your brain instantly codes that action as dangerous.
It's a super tight feedback loop.
Exactly. Yeah. But macroscopic societal change, or deeply ingrained behavioral shifts, they don't operate on the timeline of a hot stove.
They operate on the timeline of an oak tree.
Yes, precisely.
If you adopt a deeply cynical, toxic mindset today, your life doesn't collapse tomorrow.
Right, you still go to work, you still eat dinner.
Exactly. Or, from a systemic view, if a corporation slowly begins normalizing fraudulent accounting practices to meet their quarterly goals, the market doesn't crash the next morning.
The burn is delayed.
By years, sometimes decades. And the text introduces this delay, this systemic latency, not as a glitch in the universe, but as its defining operational feature.
The agricultural parallel is so vital here.
The seed analogy.
Right. If you plant a poisonous seed, the soil does not reject it.
It doesn't judge the seed.
Exactly. The soil dutifully begins the process of actualizing that seed according to its specific biological clock.
So you cannot plant a bad seed, walk away, and then return months later demanding a harvest of wheat.
You planted poison, so poison will grow.
But it will grow strictly on its own unhurried schedule.
And that's where the psychological friction occurs. Because we completely misinterpret the delay.
How so?
Well, when an individual engages in destructive behavior and sees no immediate negative consequence, their psyche interprets the silence as permission.
They think they got away with it.
Exactly. The nafs, the human ego or the self, tells them they beat the system. They mistake the gestation period of a disaster for a permanent state of safety.
I hear the elegance in that biological clock theory. I really do. But practically speaking, it's infuriating.
It is.
I mean, if I am watching a corrupt corporate board strip mine a company's assets, or I'm watching a tyrant oppress an entire nation telling me to just wait for the seeds to grow, sounds like an excuse for absolute inaction.
It feels passive.
It feels worse than passive. We crave immediate justice. We want the lightning bolt to strike the villain today.
Right.
So where is the logic in designing a universe with such agonizing lag time?
It's a great question. And the psychological agony of waiting for consequences is very real. But the text frames this delay as a profound manifestation of mercy.
Mercy. How is that mercy?
Let's look at the alternative. If the universe operated on instantaneous feedback for every complex moral or systemic action, human beings would be annihilated before we even realized we were making mistakes.
Because we wouldn't have time to learn.
Exactly. The delay is the only space where human agency actually exists.
It's a buffer zone.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It gives the human psyche the necessary time and space to recognize its error, experience an internal paradigm shift, and alter the trajectory before the biological clock runs out.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you plant that poisonous seed, the mercy of this system is that you have a window of time to realize what you've done, dig up the soil, and plant wheat before the harvest arrives.
Wow.
If justice were immediate, there would be no room for course correction.
There would be no capacity for learning at all.
Right. The latency is literally the breathing room of free will.
That's a huge perspective shift. But To actually utilize that breathing room, we have to be able to see the catastrophe while it's still just a seed.
We have to be paying attention.
We have to predict where our actions are leading long before they breach the surface. And I think this brings up the text's radical approach to the knowledge of the unseen and the seen.
Right. Al-Ghaibi wa Shahada.
What we could call the engine of reason.
Historically, the unseen has been wrapped in heavy, heavy mysticism.
Very spooky stuff.
Yeah, it's often interpreted as ghost stories, alternate dimensions, or, the hidden secrets of the divine that the human mind is utterly incapable of grasping.
It's treated as a realm of unknowable magic.
But this commentary completely strips that mysticism away.
Completely. It reinterprets the unseen and the seen as the hard science of potential versus actualization.
It turns theology into predictive analytics.
Exactly. The unseen is simply latent potential.
Think of the acorn again.
Right. To someone who has never seen a tree, the mighty oak hidden inside that tiny hard shell is entirely unseen.
It's invisible to the naked eye.
But to a botanist who understands the underlying physics and biology, the oak tree isn't a magical secret.
No, it is an absolute predictable certainty.
And that maps onto human behavior and social physics perfectly.
It really does. The scene is just the manifested reality of unseen potential.
So if you understand the hidden psychological laws governing a person,
Their quiet resentments, their unspoken anxiety.
the subtle shifts in their core values.
Yes. If you see those, you can predict their visible behavioral outcomes with terrifying accuracy.
We see this constantly in business and politics, don't we?
All the time.
A massive institution suddenly collapses overnight. Or a quiet societal movement suddenly erupts into a nationwide revolution.
And the media always reports it as a shock.
Nobody saw this coming.
Right. But the text argues that these events are never actually sudden.
Never. They are the result of what the commentary calls emergent evolution.
The potential was steadily, relentlessly building in the unseen realm for decades.
In clinical psychology, you see this too, right?
Oh, absolutely. A sudden mental breakdown is almost never a genuinely sudden event.
It's not just out of nowhere.
No, it is simply the moment when the unseen capacity to cope is finally overwhelmed, resulting in a seen manifestation.
The breakdown is the harvest.
It's the harvest of years of micro-traumas, suppressed fears, and ignored warning signs.
So the predictive power the text is urging us to develop, it comes from learning to read those unseen indicators.
Yes. If you understand the psychological raw materials that a society is generating in its private, unmonitored spaces,
You don't need a crystal ball to see its future,
you just need to understand the basic mechanics of how potential actualizes into reality.
which raises a deeply, deeply unsettling systemic question.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
Right. I mean, if every unseen potential eventually actualizes, and if the universe is running on this strict, inescapable timeline of cause and effect,
How is the data being tracked?
exactly, how does the universe know exactly what we are brewing in the dark?
And this leads us to the linguistic deep dive into verses 10 and 11.
The concept of the Muwakibat.
The guardians.
Right. And the traditional imagery surrounding the Muwakibat is very, very literal.
It's the classic folklore of physical winged angels hovering over your right and left shoulders
Carrying physical ledgers, writing down your good and bad deeds.
to protect your physical body from harm.
But the text absolutely shreds that literal interpretation.
It has to, because there's a glaring logical flaw there.
What's the flaw?
Well, if these entities were actively protecting our physical bodies, human beings would never drown, burn, or get hit by cars.
Right, because the angels would stop it.
Exactly. But the physical body is incredibly fragile, and it inevitably decays. So the protection and the recording must refer to something infinitely more profound than just a cosmic bodyguard.
And the commentary introduces them as the inescapable internalized laws of nature.
We can think of them as neural records.
Neural records, I love that.
The text explicitly states that even the thoughts whispered in the deepest recesses of the heart, or the actions hidden in the darkest night, are meticulously recorded.
It's the continuous, unbreakable tracking of cause and effect that follows every individual consciousness.
Let's modernize the analogy a bit. We used to think of this like a tape recorder in the mind.
We just hit and record.
But a better framework today might be an immutable blockchain ledger, or the compiling of source code.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it. Worldly courts and human justice systems, they operate on visible, physical evidence.
Right, they need a smoking gun.
They need a financial trail, a witness. But the laws of nature described here record the intent.
They log the raw code you are writing into your own operating system.
The psychological insight here is just staggering.
It really is. The physical body will eventually return to the earth, but the record, the internalized behavioral and psychological impact of every single decision,
Every harbored grudge.
every secret act of generosity, it survives within the structure of your psyche.
Every thought you entertain alters the physical structure of your brain through neuroplasticity.
You are constantly rewriting your own internal code.
Now, I can hear a listener getting extremely uncomfortable with this right now.
Yeah, it can sound pretty intense.
If the system is constantly tracking our unseen thoughts, is having a bad thought a cosmic crime?
Like a thought police scenario.
Exactly. If I'm sitting in traffic and have a fleeting, aggressive thought about running someone off the road, but I don't actually do it, is this universal blockchain logging a crime against me?
That sounds terrifying.
Right. It sounds like an oppressive, inescapable thought police.
It is crucial to separate this from human legal frameworks.
Hmm.
It is not about a cosmic police force punishing you for a fleeting impulse.
Okay, so what is it?
It's pure structural physics. The intent shapes the nafs.
The self.
Yes. Every thought you nurture, especially the ones you repeatedly feed in secret, acts as raw data programming your worldview.
Ah, so it's not a crime that requires a judge.
No, it is a structural alteration of your own being. If you constantly harbor deep resentments, you're literally coding your psychological infrastructure for bitterness.
You are compiling malicious code in the dark?
That's perfectly stated. And eventually, that code will execute.
Because it has to.
Right. You will become a bitter person, your micro-expressions will change, the way you speak to your colleagues will harden.
And your external world will react to that bitterness by isolating you.
Exactly. The universe doesn't have to step in and punish you with a lightning bolt.
Your own corrupted syntax does the job.
Your neural record becomes its own inescapable consequence.
There are no deleted files in the human psyche.
None.
The Muakibot aren't wardens standing over you. They're the immutable laws of psychological recording built right into you.
Whatever you input into the system of your own mind is perfectly preserved.
And it will invariably dictate the reality you experience.
Which brings us to the climax, really. That realization that our internal, unseen reality is the absolute, unyielding driver of our external seen reality.
It leads us directly to the verse 11 manifesto.
The core of everything we're discussing.
Right. This is the absolute core of our deep dive. The text delivers a statement that is framed not as a gentle suggestion or, a philosophical musing.
It's an inviolable law of social physics.
It states, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves.
It is the ultimate shift of the locus of control.
From the external environment to the internal psyche.
Yes.
Let's look at them.
It is physically impossible to sustain.
It is the equivalent of putting a fresh coat of high-gloss paint on a house with a fundamentally shattered foundation.
The paint looks beautiful for a week, and then the walls cave in.
Right. And the commentary makes a terrifying point here.
What's that?
This law of social physics is so absolute that it dictates that not even the divine will intervene to sustainably change a society's external state if their internal psychological state remains corrupt.
Wow.
If you take $1 billion of foreign aid and drop it into a nation where the internal institutional psychology is wired for corruption, tribalism, and a lack of trust, you do not cure the poverty.
You simply scale the corruption.
You just give the corruption more funding.
And the text gets incredibly blunt about the concept of praying for change in this context.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
It argues that begging the universe to fix your broken society or your failing business while you remain entirely passive and internally unchanged is actually a violation of physics.
It's like asking for that magic trick again.
Exactly. You are effectively asking the universe to break its own foundational laws just for your personal convenience.
The initiative must originate from the human side of the equation.
Because using prayer or hope as a substitute for internal action is a deeply ingrained psychological defense mechanism.
It allows you to externalize the problem.
It says the chaos is out there, the solution must come from out there, therefore I am exempt from the grueling work of changing myself.
Wow, that's confronting.
The verse 11 manifesto obliterates that defense. It violently forces the locus of control back inside.
If you want a different external reality, you have to become a different entity internally.
The commentary uses a really brilliant historical analogy to illustrate how this internal calibration actually works in practice.
The camel caravans.
Yes, the ancient camel caravans navigating the desert.
When these massive logistical operations were moving precious cargo across hostile terrain, the master drivers didn't just, load the camels, tie the ropes tightly in the morning, and then passively hope the cargo survived the journey.
No, because as the camel moved, the terrain shifted.
The animal's muscles expanded and contracted. The ropes naturally loosened over time.
An amateur driver would wait until the cargo was visibly sliding off the side of the camel before stopping the entire caravan in a panic to fix it.
Right, they wait for the external disaster to manifest before reacting.
But the master caravan drivers were engaging in continuous internal correction.
They walked alongside the camels, their eyes constantly scanning the tension of the ropes,
They would tighten a knot here, adjust a leather strap there.
subtly shifting the balance while the caravan was still moving.
They were managing the unseen potential for disaster by constantly recalibrating the internal tension of the system.
That is a masterclass in managing the nafs.
It really is. You cannot simply declare your moral values once in your 20s and assume those ropes will hold forever.
As you move through the complexities of your career and your relationships, the terrain shifts.
The ropes of your integrity loosen.
A small resentment slips in here. A minor ethical compromise loosens a knot there.
And if you aren't constantly walking alongside your own psyche, aggressively tightening those moral straps, the external cargo of your life is going to inevitably crash.
Okay, but let's address the emotional friction of this law.
Okay.
If the universe absolutely refuses to change our external condition without an internal shift, is empathy useless?
Oh, that's a tough question.
If a marginalized community is suffering under a brutal, oppressive regime or experiencing a horrific famine, are their prayers for relief just bouncing off the ceiling?
Are we saying that simply hoping for a better tomorrow is a waste of time?
Exactly.
Well, hope is not useless, but hope without a corresponding internal paradigm shift is logically incomplete.
Explain that.
The text relies on a very harsh, unyielding logic. Imagine you have your hand thrust into a roaring fire, and you are passionately, tearfully praying not to get burned.
You are hoping for relief.
But the physics of the fire do not care about the emotional intensity of your hope.
Right. The heat will burn human flesh.
The only effective prayer in that scenario is the internal decision to initiate the muscular movement required to pull your hand out of the flames.
The action is the actualized prayer.
Yes. If a society is suffering, the systemic long-term relief will only manifest when the psychological and behavioral paradigms of that society fundamentally shift.
So the hope or the prayer might provide the vital emotional endurance needed to begin that grueling internal work.
But the hope itself is not the mechanism of systemic change.
The rewiring of the nafs is the only mechanism.
Exactly.
So the burden of initiative is entirely on us. We write the new internal code, and the universe acts as the compiler executing the new external reality.
Right.
But this creates a massive operational bottleneck, which leads us directly to the crisis of human potential.
The education crisis.
Yes. If systemic change must absolutely start within the psyche, how do we actually program the nafs at scale?
How do we initiate that internal shift in an entire generation?
And this is where the text pivots into a devastating critique of modern institutions, specifically taking aim at how we handle education.
The commentary argues that modern society has fundamentally failed its youth because we are operating on a broken, highly mechanized model of human development.
We pride ourselves on having the most educated societies in the history of the world.
We do. We have sprawling universities, limitless online courses.
More raw data available on a smartphone than entire ancient empires possessed.
But the text draws a razor-sharp distinction between the modern concept of imparting information and a process called Tazkiyah.
Tazkiyah, let's break that down.
The modern educational model treats the human mind like an empty hard drive.
Right, just an empty vessel.
The sole objective is to download as much external data, historical facts, and technical skills into that hard drive as efficiently as possible.
That's imparting information.
But Tazkiyah operates on a radically different premise. The linguistic root of Tazkiyah involves growth, pruning, and the purification of something that is already alive.
It's not about pouring external data into a person.
No, it is about drawing the latent potential out of them.
The text really pushes back against the idea that humans are born with original sin, or that they are inherently dirty slates that need to be scrubbed and reprogrammed by society.
It posits that humans are born brimming with immense, positive, latent potential.
They are the acorns packed with the perfect, unseen blueprint of an oak tree.
In a true system of Tazkiyah, recognizes that you cannot force an acorn to grow by handing it a textbook on photosynthesis.
No, you have to provide the right soil, the proper hydration, and the necessary sunlight.
To allow the internal potential of that specific acorn to break open and actualize.
Modern education excels at creating highly informed, technically proficient individuals who are fundamentally stagnant on a psychological level.
They have all the data, but their NAFs, their core desires, their ethical paradigms, their capacity for resilience remains entirely undeveloped.
And the societal consequences of this mechanized education are catastrophic.
We're living through them right now.
We really are. We look at the rising generations, and the older generations constantly complain.
I know, all the time.
We curse the youth for the decay of society. We call them apathetic, addicted to superficial dopamine, incapable of deep thought.
But the text forces a terrifying mirror in front of us.
It points out that we are the architects of the very molds these youths are being poured into.
We built the education systems that prioritize standardized testing and rote memorization over the development of character.
We engineered the corporate environments that reward ruthless greed over systemic integrity.
We took the raw, brilliant potential of an entire generation, forced it into these toxic industrialized funnels, and now we have the audacity to be shocked when they emerge deformed.
It is the ultimate failure of accountability.
It really is. Because if the Verse 11 manifesto holds true that external conditions only change when internal psychology changes, then our entire societal infrastructure is aiming at the wrong target.
We are obsessed with training the intellect while completely abandoning the nafs.
And history proves, time and time again, that you cannot sustain a functional society with raw intellect alone if the underlying desires driving that intellect are corrupt.
Right. A genius with a corrupt nafs doesn't cure poverty.
You know, they just invent more sophisticated ways to steal.
Wow. Which brings us to one of the most haunting and profound concepts in the entire commentary.
It is a short phrase.
Yes, a short phrase that completely inverts how we conceptualize ambition and success.
The quote is simply, "May your desires change."
May your desires change.
That phrase is the absolute pinnacle of what Tazkiyah is trying to achieve.
Because most of us spend our entire lives trying to optimize our circumstances so we can finally get what we want.
We want more money, higher status, absolute comfort, frictionless lives.
But we rarely pause to ask, what if the things I desire are fundamentally toxic to my own psychology?
Right. True transformation, the kind of internal paradigm shift that alters the external universe, isn't about finally acquiring what you desire.
It is about elevating what you desire in the first place.
It is about moving the goalposts of your own soul.
If your baseline desire is just cheap dopamine, public validation, and instant gratification,
no amount of external wealth or technological advancement will ever make you a whole, functional human being.
And a society composed of millions of individuals chasing those baseline desires will inevitably tear itself apart.
Regardless of how elegantly their constitution is written.
But if your desires change,
if you wake up one day and suddenly find yourself desiring deep integrity, long-term systemic health, and meaningful, quiet impact,
then your daily microactions automatically align to build that reality.
The unseen shift in desire mathematically guarantees the seen outcome.
That is the precise mechanism by which the Verse 11 law is activated.
You change the desire.
The nafs reorganizes itself around that new desire.
The neural record begins logging a new pattern of intent.
And the biological clock of consequences begins ticking toward a new, profoundly different external reality.
We have covered a massive expanse of psychological and systemic ground today.
We really have. We started by confronting the miracle hunger.
Recognizing that humanity must abandon its infantile demand for magical interventions and finally respect the unyielding physics of the universe.
We examine the biological clock of consequences.
Realizing that the agonizing delay between action and outcome is not a flaw in the system, but the ultimate mercy.
A necessary buffer zone that allows us to recognize our errors and course correct before the poison takes root.
We explore the engine of reason, understanding that the unseen is not a realm of spooky mysticism.
No, it's the hard science of latent potential waiting to actualize into the seen world.
We broke down the muakibat,
the inescapable neural blockchain that rigorously logs every hidden intent, confirming that we are constantly writing the code that will define our future.
And all this culminated in the Verse 11 manifesto.
The absolute law of social physics, which dictates that the universe will forcefully refuse to upgrade our external reality until we initiate the grueling, unglamorous work of upgrading our internal psychology.
We realized we must move beyond the mere impartation of data and engage in the true work of Tazkiyah.
The elevation of our deepest desires.
So what is the ultimate implication of all this?
Where does this leave you? I want to leave you with a teaser, really. A look at the title of the very text we've been dissecting today.
Surah Ar-Ra'd.
Right. The chapter we pulled these verses from. Do you know what that translates to in English?
It translates to the thunder.
The thunder.
Mm.
If systemic change must absolutely start quietly within the self, and if that internal psychological revolution eventually gathers enough mass to burst outward and disrupt the entire external world, how does thunder represent that transition?
Thunder is not gentle.
No, it is not quiet. It is a terrifying, deafening shockwave that rattles the foundations of everything it touches.
But it is also the sound that immediately precedes the life-giving rain.
Exactly. It represents the violent, disruptive, yet incredibly productive transition from an old, stagnant, suffocating atmosphere into a vibrant, living new system.
So if the universe's internal ledger is capturing your unacted thoughts right at this very moment,
If your nafs is quietly compiling the source code that will dictate the future of your external reality,
what is the unseen seed you are currently watering in the dark?
and when that seed finally reaches the end of its gestation, when it breaches the surface and erupts into the seen world with the deafening force of thunder, will you be ready to harvest what you planted?